Hey, everyone. I've been lurking on here for a while, but never thought I'd be the one writing a post like this. My name's Rick. I'm a broadcast engineer in Atlanta, 45 years old. Married to my wife, Sharon, for 22 years. We've got 2 daughters, Jessica, 20, and Emily, 17. I thought we were the kind of couple people looked up to, the type who made it through all the ups and downs and still held hands. I'd always been proud of what we had. Until last Thursday. I wasn't supposed to be at Sharon's office that day. I'd wrapped up a project early and thought I'd surprise her with lunch, her favorite chicken salad from that little deli she loves. I was feeling good about it, thinking about how her face would light up when she saw me standing there with her lunch. When I got to her building, the receptionist let me in without question. Sharon's office door was ajar, so I figured I'd poke my head in and catch her off guard. That's when I heard the voices. Sharon's voice, and another voice, male, familiar. I didn't think much of it at first. Then I heard laughter, soft and intimate. My stomach tightened. I froze. I know I should have walked away. Maybe called out to let them know I was there. But curiosity, or something darker, rooted me in place. The next few words hit me like a punch to the gut. Bob Shelter. Our pastor. A man I've respected for years, trusted with our spiritual guidance. I heard Sharon giggle and call him honey. Then there were other sounds. Unmistakable sounds. My heart started racing, and I felt this cold wave crash over me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I wanted to storm in, demand answers, yell, cry something. But I didn't. I walked out as quietly as I'd come in, leaving the lunch on a nearby table. The ride home was a blur. My hands were gripping the wheel so hard they hurt. I kept trying to tell myself I'd misunderstood, that there had to be another explanation. But deep down I knew. That night, I couldn't sleep. I just kept replaying it in my head, over and over. Sharon came home later than usual, smiling and acting normal like nothing had happened. She asked how my day was, kissed me on the cheek, and I just stood there. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I need to know for sure, to understand how this happened. I don't even know how to start piecing together what's left of my life. Right now, I'm stuck in this nightmare, and I don't know how to wake up the next morning. I felt like a zombie. I barely slept, and my mind wouldn't stop racing. Sharon was in the kitchen making coffee, humming to herself like everything was fine. I couldn't believe how normal she seemed, how effortlessly she could act like nothing was wrong. "Morning, Rick," she said with that easy smile of hers. I mumbled back something resembling morning and grabbed a cup of coffee, avoiding her eyes. I could feel her watching me, but I couldn't bring myself to look at her. All I could think about was Bob Shelter. Pastor Bob. I kept replaying every interaction we'd had with him, wondering if there had been signs I'd missed. I mean, he baptized our daughters, for crying out loud. We've had him over for dinner more times than I can count. I decided I needed proof. Maybe I was overreacting, maybe it wasn't what it sounded like. But if it was, I couldn't go in blind. That day, I told Sharon I had to work late, which wasn't uncommon in my line of work. Instead, I drove to the church. I knew Bob's schedule pretty well. He always stayed late on Wednesdays, preparing for the midweek service. I parked across the street and waited. Sure enough, around 7:30, I saw Sharon's car pull into the lot. My chest tightened as I watched her get out, glance around, and head toward the side door of the church. I didn't follow her. I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I waited, staring at the church door like it might explode. It felt like an eternity, but it was probably about an hour before she came back out, looking flustered. When she got home later, I asked how her day was. She said she'd had a long meeting with a client that ran over, and traffic was awful. She said it so casually, like lying was second nature to her. I felt my blood boil, but I forced myself to stay calm. "You must be tired," I said, trying to sound normal. "Exhausted," she replied, leaning in to kiss my cheek. I wanted to push her away, to scream, to demand the truth. But instead, I just nodded and watched her walk upstairs like everything was fine. I can't believe this is my life now, tiptoeing around my own wife, trying to figure out if I even know who she is anymore. I need to confront her. I know I do. But I want to be prepared. I need to know the whole story before I throw it all on the table. For now, I'll keep gathering pieces of the puzzle. I just hope I can hold it together long enough to make sense of it all, The next few days were torture. I couldn't stop watching Sharon, analyzing every little thing she did. The way she laughed at her phone, the sudden trips to run errands, the way she seemed lighter, happier. I hated myself for noticing, hated her for making me feel this way. I started thinking back over the years. Had I missed something? Were there cracks in our marriage I just ignored because it was easier? Looking back, there were little things, comments she'd made, moments that didn't add up. Like last year, when she started spending more time at church for volunteer work. I'd teased her about becoming a saint, and she just laughed it off, saying it gave her purpose. Or the time she forgot our anniversary. Sharon never forgets anything. She apologized 100 times, blaming work stress, but now I wondered if it was really Bob who'd been occupying her mind. I thought about the way she used to look at me when we first got married, like I was her whole world. When did that stop? Or had I stopped noticing? I didn't want to believe our life was a lie. But the more I dug, the more it felt like I'd been living in a house of cards, and someone had just yanked out the bottom one. That Sunday, we went to church as a family. Sitting in the pews, I couldn't even bring myself to look at Bob. When he stood at the pulpit, talking about forgiveness and love, I felt like the walls were closing in on me. At one point, Sharon squeezed my hand. I looked over at her, and she smiled that sweet, loving smile she's always had. For a split second, I thought maybe I was wrong, maybe I'd misunderstood everything. But then I saw the way Bob looked at her from across the room, just a flicker of something in his eyes. And I knew. When we got home, Sharon asked me if I was okay. "You've seemed off lately," she said, concern etched on her face. "I'm fine," I lied, forcing a smile. I wasn't fine. I was drowning, and she was the one holding my head under. That night, I decided I needed concrete evidence. I couldn't keep living in this fog of suspicion and doubt. I had to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. So, I set up a plan. Nothing invasive or illegal, I wasn't about to stoop that low. But I needed something undeniable, something I could hold in my hands and say, "This is what you did to me." Because when the confrontation finally came, and it would, I wanted to make sure there was no way she could talk her way out of it. Once I decided to gather evidence, it was like flipping a switch in my brain. The shock and hurt were still there, but now they were paired with a sense of purpose. If Sharon and Bob were doing this, I wasn't going to let them gaslight me into thinking I was crazy. I started small. Sharon's phone had always been an open book. She'd leave it on the counter, unlocked without a second thought. But lately, she'd been more protective of it. It was subtle, putting it face down, taking it with her when she left the room, but I noticed. One night after she fell asleep, I quietly picked up her phone. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might wake her. The phone was locked, and I didn't know her new passcode. She'd changed it a few months back, claiming it was because of security concerns. At the time, I hadn't thought twice about it. I put the phone back down, feeling a fresh wave of frustration. If she had nothing to hide, why change the passcode? The next day, I went to a buddy of mine, Kevin. He's one of those tech-savvy guys who knows how to make a computer do just about anything. I told him I needed help with a project, leaving out the specifics, and he handed me a small recording device. "Hide this wherever you want," he said. "It's got great range, and the battery lasts about a week." I thanked him and slipped it into my pocket, my stomach twisting. I hated that it had come to this, but I didn't see any other way. That evening, when Sharon left to run errands, I placed the device under the driver's seat of her car. My hands were shaking the whole time, but I told myself it wasn't wrong to want the truth. The next few days were agonizing. Every time Sharon left, I wondered what she was really doing. I started noticing little details I'd ignored before. Her favorite perfume on days when she didn't have meetings, new lingerie in the laundry I hadn't seen her wear at home. I played the waiting game, telling myself to be patient. It wasn't easy, especially when she smiled at me over dinner or laughed with the girls like nothing had changed. Finally, after 5 long days, I retrieved the device. I sat in my car, hands trembling as I plugged it into my laptop to play the recordings. Most of it was mundane, radio playing, the hum of traffic, but then I heard her voice. She was on the phone, and though I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, her tone said it all. "Miss you too," she said softly. "I can't wait to see you." My stomach turned. She laughed, that same laugh I'd heard in her office. "No, you're the one who's trouble." "Yeah, tomorrow night works." I stopped the recording, My jaw clenched so tight it hurt. There was no way I could convince myself this was innocent anymore. Tomorrow night. I had my chance. This was it, the moment I'd confront her and finally get the answers I needed. No matter how much they hurt, the next day felt like it lasted a lifetime. I went to work, but I couldn't focus. Every email, every conversation, every task blurred together. All I could think about was Sharon, the voice on that recording, and what I might walk into that evening. I knew she was meeting him. I just didn't know where. The idea of her with Bob made my skin crawl, but I pushed the thought aside. This wasn't the time to let emotions take over. When I got home, Sharon was in the kitchen making dinner, humming a tune I didn't recognize. It felt surreal watching her move around like any other day, completely unaware that I knew. "Hey," she said, smiling. "How was work?" "Fine," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "You?" "Busy," she said. "But good. I might head out for a little bit tonight, though. I told Susan I'd help her organize her garage for her big yard sale this weekend." Susan. Her best friend. The one she always used as a cover when she needed a convenient excuse. "Sure," I said, forcing a smile. Dinner was painfully normal. Jessica and Emily talked about school and their friends, and Sharon chimed in with advice and jokes. I tried to act like nothing was wrong, but my mind was racing, planning my next move. After dinner, Sharon got ready to leave. She gave me a quick kiss on the cheek and promised she wouldn't be too late. I waited until her car disappeared down the street before grabbing my keys and heading out. The recording had given me one clue: they were meeting tonight. I figured the church was the most likely spot, so I drove there first. Sure enough, Sharon's car was parked in the lot, and Bob's was right next to it. I parked a short distance away, out of sight, and made my way to the side of the building. The lights in Bob's office were on, the blinds half closed. I crept closer, my heart pounding like a drum. Through the gap in the blinds, I saw them. Sharon was sitting on the edge of Bob's desk, laughing at something he said. He stood close, his hand resting on her knee. It felt like a punch to the chest. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. Part of me wanted to burst in, to demand an explanation, but another part of me held back. I needed to hear what they were saying. I moved closer to the window, careful not to make a sound. "I just don't know how much longer I can keep this up," Sharon said, her voice low. "Rick's been acting different lately. I think he suspects something." Bob stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You don't need to worry about Rick. He's too blind to see what's right in front of him." The way they spoke about me, like I was some clueless fool, lit a fire in my chest. Sharon sighed. "I just hate lying to him. I hate lying to the girls." Bob cupped her face, tilting her chin up to meet his eyes. "You deserve to be happy, Sharon. We deserve to be happy." That was it. I couldn't listen anymore. My hand clenched into a fist as I turned and walked back to my car. This wasn't how I'd planned to confront her, but there was no turning back now. I had what I needed, the truth, right in front of me. When Sharon came home that night, I'd be ready. Sharon got home around 10 p.m., her expression calm, her demeanor relaxed. She walked into the kitchen, where I sat at the table nursing a cup of coffee I didn't even want. "Hey," she said, setting her purse down. "Everything okay? You're up late." "Yeah," I replied, my voice tight. "I've been thinking." She paused, her hand hovering over her purse. "Thinking about what?" I stared at her for a moment, my chest heavy with anger and sadness. "About us. About trust. About honesty." Her smile faltered, just for a split second, before she caught herself. "Rick, what's going on?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. "I went by the church tonight." Her face went pale. "The church?" "Yeah. You know, the place you went instead of Susan's garage." She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her eyes darting around like she was searching for an escape. "Rick, I can explain." "No," I said, cutting her off. "You can't. I saw you, Sharon. I saw you with him." Her shoulders slumped, and she let out a shaky breath. "Rick, it's not what you think." "Don't," I snapped, my voice louder than I intended. "Don't insult me by pretending there's a reasonable explanation for this. I heard you. I saw you." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel any sympathy. "Not now." "How long?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, her hands wringing together. It's not like that. Bob and we just... Don't lie to me, Sharon, I said, standing up so quickly the chair scraped against the floor. How long? She flinched at the sharpness in my voice. A few months, she admitted, barely above a whisper. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Months? Months, Sharon? While I was here, loving you, trusting you, you were sneaking around with him. She wiped at her eyes, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for it to happen, Rick. I didn't. You didn't mean to betray me? To betray our family? Then what, Sharon? What did you mean to do? I was unhappy, she said, her voice trembling. I felt lost. And Bob was there. He listened to me, he understood. Don't you dare put this on me, I said, pointing at her. Don't you dare act like this is my fault because you felt unhappy. She started sobbing, her face buried in her hands. I'm sorry, Rick. I'm so sorry. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to scream, to cry, to throw something. Instead, I turned and walked out of the room. Rick, she called after me, but I didn't stop. I needed space, air, anything to keep me from completely losing it. I went to the garage and sat in the car, staring at the dashboard as her words echoed in my head. She was sorry. But sorry didn't erase months of lies. Sorry didn't fix the damage she'd done. And sorry sure as hell didn't make it hurt any less. I stayed in the garage for what felt like hours, staring at the darkened street through the windshield. Sharon didn't come after me. Maybe she knew I needed space, or maybe she was too scared to face me again. Either way, I didn't care. When I finally went back inside, the house was silent. The lights were off except for the small lamp in the living room. Sharon wasn't on the couch or in the kitchen. I found her upstairs in our bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, her face streaked with tears. She looked up when I walked in. Rick, please. We need to talk. Talk about what? I said, my voice flat. You've already said everything, haven't you? She stood up, reaching for me, but I stepped back. Rick, it wasn't supposed to go this far. I swear. It just happened. I laughed bitterly. It just happened? You accidentally fell into an affair with the pastor? Is that what you're telling me? Her face crumpled, and she sank back onto the bed, her hands gripping the edge like it was the only thing holding her together. I didn't mean to hurt you, she whispered. Well, congratulations, Sharon, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. You managed to destroy everything we built in 22 years without even meaning to. Her sobs filled the room, but I couldn't find it in me to comfort her. Not this time. I turned away, running a hand through my hair, trying to think. What do we do now? She asked between sobs. I didn't answer right away. My thoughts were a mess, tangled in anger, betrayal, and pain. I don't know, I finally said. But I can't look at you right now. I need time. She nodded, wiping at her face. Where will you go? I'm not leaving, I said firmly. This is my house too. I'll sleep in the guest room. She flinched at the coldness in my tone but didn't argue. Rick. I'm so sorry. I'll do anything to fix this. I stared at her for a long moment, trying to find some trace of the woman I thought I knew. You should have thought about that before you ran to him instead of me. I turned and left, heading to the guest room. I could hear her crying as I closed the door, but I didn't look back. Lying in the unfamiliar bed, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. How do you even begin to fix something this broken? Can you? For the first time in years, I wasn't sure what the future held for us, or if there even was a future anymore. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of my daughters moving around the house. Jessica and Emily were both early risers, unlike Sharon and me. I sat up, the reality of last night hitting me like a ton of bricks. I didn't know what to say to them, if I should say anything at all. They deserved the truth, but how do you tell your kids something like this without completely shattering their world? When I went downstairs, Sharon was already in the kitchen, making pancakes like it was just another Saturday morning. Jessica and Emily were sitting at the table, chatting about something on their phones. Morning, Dad, Jessica said with a smile. Morning, I mumbled, grabbing a cup of coffee. Sharon glanced at me, her expression unreadable. I made pancakes, she said softly, like she was trying to bridge the gap between us. I nodded but didn't respond. I wasn't ready to play happy family yet. As we ate, I couldn't help but notice Sharon's forced cheerfulness. She laughed at Jessica's jokes, asked Emily about her weekend plans, and acted like everything was perfectly fine. It was infuriating. After breakfast, I told the girls I needed to talk to them. Sharon froze, her spatula hovering over the stove. "Rick," she said quickly, "maybe we should." "No," I said firmly. "They deserve to know." Jessica frowned. "Know what?" I sat down at the table, trying to find the right words. "Girls, your mom and I are going through something right now." Emily looked worried. "What do you mean? Are you guys okay?" Sharon walked over, sitting beside me. "We're having some issues," she said, her voice trembling. Jessica's eyes narrowed. "What kind of issues?" I hesitated, glancing at Sharon. Her face was pale, and she looked like she was about to cry again. I didn't want to throw her under the bus, but I couldn't lie to them either. "There's been a betrayal," I said carefully. "Something that's hurt our family." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "What? Mom, Dad, what's going on?" Jessica, always the more perceptive one, stared at Sharon. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice cold. Sharon's lip trembled. "Jessica, She cheated," I said bluntly, cutting her off. There was no point in sugarcoating it. "She's been seeing someone else." The room went silent. Emily looked like she'd been punched in the gut, while Jessica's face twisted in anger. "Are you serious?" Jessica snapped, glaring at Sharon. "With who?" "That's not important right now," I said quickly, not wanting to drag Bob into this just yet. "It's not important," Jessica said, her voice rising. "You just dropped a bomb on us, and now you're saying it's not important?" "Jessica, please," Sharon said, tears streaming down her face. "I made a mistake." "I'm so sorry." "A mistake?" Jessica shot back. "You don't just accidentally cheat on your husband, Mom. What the hell is wrong with you?" "Stop it!" Emily cried, her voice breaking. "Just stop." Jessica looked at her sister, then at me, her expression hardening. "I can't believe this." She stood up, grabbing her keys. "I need to get out of here." "Jessica, wait," Sharon called, but she was already out the door. Emily buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. I wanted to comfort her, but I didn't even know where to start. "I'm sorry," Sharon whispered, looking at me with desperation in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Rick." I couldn't look at her. "It's not me you should be apologizing to right now." I walked out, leaving her to deal with the fallout she'd created. Jessica didn't come home that night. I texted her a few times, but she didn't respond until the next morning. She was staying at her friend Kayla's house and needed some space. I understood, though it hurt to see how shattered she was. Emily, on the other hand, barely spoke a word. She spent most of the day in her room, only coming out for a few minutes to grab a snack or a drink. Every time I saw her, I felt the weight of what this was doing to her. Sharon tried to talk to me several times, but I wasn't ready. Every time she opened her mouth, I felt a fresh wave of anger rise in my chest. That evening, I decided to take a drive, clear my head. I ended up in front of the church, staring at the dimly lit building where everything had unraveled. I didn't know what I was hoping to find. Answers? Closure? Instead, I found Bob Shelter's car parked near the entrance. I sat there for a while, debating whether I should confront him. Eventually, I got out of the car and walked to the door. It was unlocked. The church was quiet, almost eerie. I followed the faint sound of voices down the hall, stopping when I reached Bob's office. The door was cracked open just enough for me to see inside. Bob was sitting at his desk, talking to someone on the phone. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this under wraps," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Rick's not an idiot, Sharon. He's going to figure it out." I froze. Hearing him say her name made my blood boil. Bob sighed. "You need to keep him calm. The last thing we need is for this to blow up in the church." My fists clenched. He wasn't worried about my family or even Sharon. He was worried about his image, his reputation. "I know," he continued. "I'll handle it. Just try to keep things normal at home, okay?" I pushed the door open, and Bob's head snapped up. "Rick," he said, his face going pale. This isn't what it looks like." I stepped into the room, my voice low and steady. "Really? Because it looks like you're giving my wife advice on how to cover up your affair." He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't let him. "You stood in my home, ate at my table, Baptized my daughters, I said, my voice shaking with rage. And the whole time, you were sneaking around with my wife? Rick, listen, he stammered, holding up his hands. I know how this looks, but… No, I snapped, stepping closer. You don't get to explain. I heard everything, Bob. I saw everything. He looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting toward the door. I made a mistake, he said quickly. We both did. But it wasn't about you, Rick. It was about us. Us. I repeated, laughing bitterly. There's no us. You're a parasite, Bob. You took advantage of my wife, my family, and now you want to justify it. I'm sorry, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I never meant for this to happen. I shook my head, disgusted. You're a coward. A hypocrite. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who you are. His eyes widened. Rick, please. But I was already walking out the door, leaving him to stew in his guilt. The next step was clear. It was time to bring the truth to light. No matter how messy it got, driving home that night, I felt an odd sense of calm, like the storm in my head had settled for the first time since this nightmare began. I wasn't confused anymore, and I wasn't second-guessing myself. I knew what I had to do. When I got home, Sharon was sitting in the living room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked up when I walked in, her face full of worry. Where were you? She asked softly. At the church, I replied, setting my keys on the counter. Her eyes widened. Rick, I can explain. No, I interrupted, holding up a hand. I've already heard all the explanations I need. I talked to Bob. She paled. You what? I confronted him, I said, my voice steady. He told me enough to confirm what I already knew. And now, I think it's time everyone else knows too. Her face crumpled. Rick, please. Don't do this. Don't drag this out into the open. You don't get to ask me for favors, Sharon, I snapped. Not after what you've done. She stood up, tears streaming down her face. Think about the girls. Think about how this will affect them. Please, Rick, I'm begging you. I am thinking about them, I said, my voice breaking. I'm thinking about how they deserve to know the truth. How they deserve to see who their mother and the man they trusted really are. Sharon collapsed onto the couch, sobbing into her hands. I couldn't watch her cry anymore. It didn't feel real, not her tears, not her words. None of it. I went upstairs to check on Emily. Her door was open just a crack, and I could see her sitting on her bed, staring at her phone. Hey, I said softly, stepping inside. She looked up, her eyes red and puffy. Hi, Dad. I sat down beside her, unsure of what to say. You okay? She shrugged, picking at the edge of her blanket. Jessica texted me. She's staying at Kayla's another night. She's really mad. I know, I said, sighing. And she has every right to be. Emily looked at me, her eyes searching mine. What happens now? Are you and Mom gonna split up? I hesitated. I don't know, Em. I really don't. But whatever happens, I want you to know that none of this is your fault. You and your sister are the most important people in my life, and I'll always be here for you. She nodded, her lip trembling. I hate her for what she did. I put an arm around her, pulling her close. It's okay to feel that way. It's okay to be angry. Just don't let it eat you up, okay? We'll get through this. I promise. I stayed with her until she fell asleep, then headed back downstairs. Sharon was still on the couch, her face buried in her hands. I'm calling a family meeting tomorrow, I said firmly. You, me, the girls. We're going to lay everything out in the open. No more lies. She looked up, her face streaked with tears. Rick, please. There has to be another way. There's not, I said, my voice cold. You wanted to build a life on lies, Sharon. Now it's time to face the truth. I went to bed without another word, determined to see this through. Tomorrow the illusion of our perfect family would finally shatter, and maybe, just maybe, we could start picking up the pieces. The next morning, I woke up early, my stomach twisting into knots. I knew today was going to be one of the hardest days of my life, but there was no backing out now. The truth was already out in pieces, and it was time to put it all on the table. Jessica came home mid-morning, her face set in a stony expression. She barely looked at Sharon and only nodded when I greeted her. Emily lingered near the stairs, her eyes darting between us. Can we just get this over with? Jessica asked, crossing her arms. I nodded and motioned for everyone to sit in the living room. Sharon sat on one end of the couch, looking small and fragile, while the girls and I took the opposite side. The divide between us felt physical, like a canyon no one could cross. I know this has been a lot to take in, I began, my voice steady but low. But we need to talk about it, everything. You girls deserve to know the truth. Sharon flinched but didn't argue. Jessica cut her eyes at her mother. The truth? Fine. Let's start there. Who is he? Sharon hesitated, her hands twisting in her lap. I could see the shame on her face, but I didn't step in to save her. It's Pastor Bob, Sharon said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jessica's jaw dropped, and Emily gasped. Are you kidding me? Jessica spat. The pastor? Mom, how could you? I didn't mean for it to happen, Sharon said, tears streaming down her face. I swear. I never wanted to hurt anyone. But you did, Jessica said, her voice shaking with rage. You hurt all of us. You betrayed Dad. You betrayed us. And with him? Do you have any idea how disgusting that is? Emily, who had been silent up until now, started crying. I trusted him, she sobbed. I thought he was supposed to be a good person. Sharon reached out toward her. Emily, I'm so sorry. Don't, Emily snapped, pulling away. Just don't. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of everything crushing down on us. I've already confronted Bob, I said finally, breaking the silence. He admitted everything. And I'm not letting him get away with it. The church board is going to hear about this. Sharon's head snapped up. Rick, no. Please. Think about the fallout. The fallout. I interrupted, my voice rising. You're worried about his reputation? What about the fallout in our family, Sharon? What about the damage you've done to us? She started crying again, and Jessica rolled her eyes. You're unbelievable, she said. Still trying to protect him after everything. I turned to the girls. I know this is a lot to handle, but I want you to know something. None of this changes how much I love you. I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you're okay through all of this. Jessica nodded, her eyes hard. Thanks, Dad. At least one of you cares about this family. Emily sniffled, wiping her eyes. Are you guys getting divorced? I hesitated, glancing at Sharon. Her eyes were full of desperation, but I couldn't give her the reassurance she wanted. I don't know yet, I said honestly. But things aren't going to be the same. That's all I can say right now. The meeting ended on that note, the weight of uncertainty hanging over us. Jessica stormed out again, saying she couldn't be in the house with Sharon. Emily retreated to her room, leaving me and Sharon alone. I'm trying to fix this, Sharon said, her voice shaking. Some things can't be fixed, I replied, walking away. As I sat in the quiet of the guest room, I couldn't help but wonder if this family meeting had solved anything, or if it had only pushed us closer to the edge. The day after the family meeting, I knew what I had to do. If Bob thought he could walk away from this unscathed, he was in for a rude awakening. He'd used his position to manipulate Sharon, betrayed our trust, and desecrated everything he claimed to stand for. I called the head of the church board, a man named Harold. Harold had been a fixture in the congregation for decades, a no-nonsense type with a reputation for integrity. I figured if anyone would take this seriously, it would be him. Rick, Harold said when he picked up. Good to hear from you. What's on your mind? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. Harold, there's something going on with Bob, Harold. There's something going on with Bob that I need to talk to you about. It's serious, I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling inside me. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What kind of serious are we talking about, Rick? Harold asked, his tone cautious. I hesitated for just a moment. Saying it out loud made it feel even more real, but I knew there was no backing out now. Bob's been having an affair with Sharon. The silence that followed was heavy. I could almost hear Harold processing what I'd just said. Rick, he said finally, his voice low and measured. Are you absolutely certain about this? Yes, I said firmly. I have proof. I confronted him, and he admitted to it. This isn't just hearsay, Harold. He's betrayed me, my family, and this congregation. Harold let out a long sigh. This is a lot to take in. You're right, it's a betrayal on so many levels. I'm going to need to gather the other board members and address this immediately. Will you be willing to come to a meeting and share what you know? Absolutely, I said. I'll bring whatever proof you need. We agreed on a time for the meeting, and I hung up, feeling both relieved and anxious. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. The meeting was held the next evening in the church's fellowship hall. It was just Harold, the other board members, and me. The room was dimly lit, the kind of setting that made everything feel heavier. I laid out everything, the recordings, the things Sharon admitted, the confrontation with Bob. I didn't hold anything back. As I spoke, the board members exchanged glances, their faces a mix of shock, anger, and sadness. When I finished, Harold leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. This is devastating, Rick. Absolutely devastating. Bob's actions are not just a personal failing, they're a betrayal of the entire congregation. He's broken the trust we placed in him as a leader. Another board member, Susan, shook her head. This is going to rock the church. People are going to be hurt. Some might even leave. But we can't sweep this under the rug. Agreed, Harold said. We'll need to confront Bob and ask for his resignation immediately. After that, we'll address the congregation and let them know what's happened. Hearing those words felt like a small victory, but it was bittersweet. No matter what happened to Bob, my family was still broken. The board wasted no time. By the next morning, Bob was officially removed from his position. Word spread quickly, and the church was in turmoil. Some people were outraged, demanding answers. Others were in denial, refusing to believe their beloved pastor could do such a thing. For me, it was a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. Watching Bob's carefully crafted image crumble felt like justice, but it didn't erase the pain he'd caused, or fix what had been broken in my home. Sharon avoided me for most of the day, keeping to herself in the bedroom. The girls were distant too, each dealing with their own emotions in their own way. That evening, I sat in the kitchen with a glass of whiskey, staring at nothing in particular. Sharon came in quietly, her eyes red and puffy. They removed him, didn't they? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, I said without looking at her. He's done. She nodded, hugging herself. I guess I deserve that too. To be done. I glanced at her, feeling a flicker of pity. This isn't about you, Sharon. It's about him. What happens to you? That's still up to me. Her lip trembled, but she didn't say anything. She just turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The fallout was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was starting to regain control of my life. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Bob's removal from the church sent shockwaves through the congregation. Some rallied around the board's decision, while others whispered about scandal and betrayal. I didn't care about the rumors. The truth was out, and Bob was gone. At home, things were tense. Jessica still wasn't speaking to Sharon, and Emily avoided both of us as much as possible. The silence in the house was deafening. One evening, Sharon approached me while I was sitting in the guest room. Rick, she said softly, what happens now? I looked at her, feeling a mix of anger and exhaustion. I don't know, Sharon. But right now, I need space. For me. For the girls. She nodded, tears in her eyes, but didn't push further. That night, I emailed a lawyer. I wasn't ready to make any final decisions, but I needed to know my options. Whatever happened next, I knew there was no going back to the way things were, and the days that followed, I focused on the practical. I met with the lawyer and discussed separation options. It felt surreal, but it also gave me a sense of control over the chaos. Jessica stayed distant, spending most of her time at Kayla's. Emily, though quieter, began opening up a little. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching TV, she leaned against me and said, "I'm glad you're here, Dad." Those words hit me hard. It reminded me that, no matter how broken things felt, I still had a purpose, being there for my daughters. Sharon tried to talk a few times, but I kept it short. "I'm not ready to have this conversation," I told her. Each time, she nodded, her guilt written all over her face. The house felt like it was in limbo, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a small flicker of hope. Not for Sharon and me, but for myself, for my daughters, and for whatever came next. 2 weeks after the truth came out, Sharon asked to talk. I braced myself for another apology or plea for reconciliation, but what she said floored me. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice steady for the first time in weeks. I stared at her. "Leaving? What do you mean?" I've been thinking about everything I've done, she said, tears welling up. I've hurt you, the girls, everyone. Staying here isn't fixing anything. I need to go. To figure myself out and stop causing more damage. Where would you even go? I asked, my voice edged with disbelief. She hesitated. I've been looking into a retreat center out west, a place where I can reflect, heal, and work on myself. It's not permanent, but it's what I need right now. The weight of her words sank in. I expected her to cling to what was left of our marriage, to fight to stay, but here she was, making the choice to leave. What about the girls? I asked. I'll talk to them, she said, her voice breaking. I'll visit when they're ready to see me. But for now, I think they need space too. For the first time, I saw something in Sharon I hadn't seen in years: clarity. She wasn't running to Bob or anyone else. She was finally facing herself. The next morning, she packed her things. Emily hugged her briefly, tears in her eyes, while Jessica stayed in her room, refusing to come out. Sharon didn't push. Before she walked out the door, she turned to me. I know it doesn't mean much now, but I'm sorry, Rick. For everything. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. And then she was gone. As I stood in the doorway, watching her car disappear down the street, I felt a strange mix of emotions: sadness, relief, and something I hadn't felt in weeks: peace. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined, but maybe it was the one we needed. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we might all have a chance to heal.